Well, the BC government is rolling out a series of countermeasures to U.S. tariffs. Among them is the Economic Stabilization Act. Now, if it's passed, it would allow the government to respond without having to go through the BC Legislature for debate. And Premier David Eby has said the response is necessary to protect jobs and protect businesses. Opposition parties, however, are not convinced. And BC Conservative leader John Rustad says it gives the government a blank check with no oversight. Well, for more on how this might actually impact our economy, we have reached Marc Lee. He's a senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Good morning to you, Marc.
Hi, good morning, Stephen.
So Premier David Eby says that this emergency legislation is necessary to respond to economic threats from the U.S. And John Rustad, the Conservative Party leader, says that this would, quote, transform Eby into BC's very own dictator. What powers does this actually give the provincial government?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it's a very unusual bill. It's both sweeping in scope, but there are also a lot of caveats, and it's time limited. It seems to put a lot of discretion in the hands of the premier and the cabinet. Mostly, I think this is political theater. A lot of what's on the table here is very hypothetical. In a sense, there's the government does not need to go to the legislature for most regulations. They're already delegated to the authority of the government or ministries. So in some sense, this has removed some of the process at the ministerial level, but doesn't fundamentally change the already high concentration of power that we see in the BC government. The only really specific thing in the bill is the interesting one, which is the possibility that BC could place tolls on trucks bound for Alaska. So far, that's just a saber rattling. And I guess the concern is, does this put us in a sort of tit-for-tat retaliation scenario with Alaska? They, of course, are now threatening to get laws changed so that cruise ships don't have to stop in BC ports on the way to Alaska. So ultimately, that's a bit of a dangerous game if we're getting into tit-for-tat retaliation, as we saw when Ontario had to walk back its 25% tariff on electricity.
The government, though, says that this bill is going to help protect BC jobs and businesses. I mean, in practical terms, how would it actually do that?
It's not clear exactly. It's more of a trust us type of language. There's a real lack of public engagement on what the public's priorities are. There's a lack of public review. And there's a lack of any sort of sense of what our short and long-term strategy is for the province and how this will get us to those ends. One area that is brought up is around measures that could promote internal trade or interprovincial trade. But there's a real lack of any specifics or examples of what this is trying to solve. So it's kind of like BC's pretending to be at the forefront of this problem, but it's not really clear there's much of a problem at all. In fact, if you go back to the mandate letters that were issued to ministers in mid-January, you find internal trade appearing exactly 0 times. Even in the Minister for Jobs and Economic Development, they have a 10-point agenda that talks about improving trade with Asia and supporting businesses. Interprovincial trade appears exactly 0 times. So I think this is largely a non-issue, but it's the premiers around the country feeling like they need to be doing something in the face of the public and to respond to the tariffs, but ultimately there's not a whole lot there that hasn't already been addressed with existing processes like the Canadian Free Trade Agreement that was signed in 2017.
So how does any government try to maintain economic stability when faced with tariffs if they're not and not get into a tit-for-tat tariff war?
Well, I mean, one thing that it's important for the government to do is to lean into the economic impact of the tariffs, and that it, I think, did fairly well in tabling its budget, which had a larger deficit than anticipated and increased capital spending. All of those will support the BC economy through difficult times at a time when households and businesses are retrenching somewhat. I prefer not to go the route of tit-for-tat retaliation on tariffs because that increases costs for households and businesses. But we should be looking at what are some of the sources of American economic power and economic interests within BC. Huge amount of American ownership in the resource sector. I think there's a lot of other things that we could do to challenge those interests and not increase costs for British Columbians.
Yeah, well, give me an example of something that could be done. I mean, when you say there's a huge amount of U.S. ownership in the resource sector, what could you do with that?
Well, I mean, we'd be looking at bringing some of that American ownership back under British Columbia or Canadian control, repatriating some of the assets in that sector. There's other areas as well, like, and this would require cooperation of the federal government, but intellectual property is an area where we've given huge concessions to the United States. So we could go back to the old system in Canada where we had compulsory licensing that built up a strong generic drug industry. So we could actually be challenging economic power from the United States while lowering drug costs for Canadians and building out a pharmacare program that's going to improve our healthcare. Like, I think that's the type of outside the box thinking we need to have. I think really what we're seeing right now is still a strategy that thinks we are going to bend but not break, and hopefully at the end of a short amount of time we'll be back to normal with our relations with the United States. But I don't think that's tenable anymore.
And so is this bill really necessary to accomplish any of what you're talking about?
It's questionable. I think it's a lot of the items in here are very hypothetical. Again, it's very sweeping. How will it be used? What type of accountability mechanisms are there? What problems does it solve? I don't think the government itself has answered those questions.
And do you worry, as John Rustad does, about this being misused?
I mean, I think political power is already extremely concentrated in British Columbia, and this deepens that. I would love to see processes that, if it is emergency powers and we're in a trade war, in other situations where we are at war, it's not unprecedented to inform the opposition parties on a regular basis. So that could be a simple amendment that just kept them up to date in real time about the measures that the government is taking according to this law. So we need to get through a couple more readings of this bill before it's passed, and hopefully we'll see a better bill at the end of the day.